New York City in the decades after World War II carried a strange dual rhythm. By day, the streets moved with honest ambition, dockworkers unloading cargo along the waterfront, shopkeepers raising steel shutters before sunrise, families climbing subway steps on their way to school and work. By night, another current flowed quietly beneath the surface. Deals were whispered in back rooms. Loyalty was tested in silence. Power was measured not by titles on paper, but by influence that could never be written down. In that hidden world, names mattered. Some names inspired respect, others created fear, and a few very rarely became legends long before their stories were finished. One of those names was John Gotti. He was not born powerful. He was not raised in comfort. Like many children of immigrant families trying to survive in mid-century America, his early life unfolded inside crowded apartments where money was scarce and opportunity felt distant. The neighborhoods of Brooklyn were alive with culture, family bonds, and resilience, but they also carried hardship. For young boys growing up in those streets, the line between ambition and danger could blur quickly. John Gotti learned early that the world rewarded boldness. School never held his attention for long. Structure felt restrictive, while the energy of the streets felt immediate and real. Older neighborhood figures, men who dressed sharply, spoke confidently, and always seemed to have cash in their pockets, left a strong impression on him. To a restless teenager searching for identity, they looked like proof that power could be claimed rather than earned slowly. Small risks came first. Petty theft, running errands for older boys, testing boundaries just far enough to feel excitement without fully understanding consequences. Each step felt minor in the moment, but together they formed a path leading steadily away from ordinary life. What made John Gotti different from countless other troubled teenagers was not just his willingness to take risks. It was his hunger to be seen. Some people drift quietly through the edges of the criminal world. Gotti wanted recognition. He wanted presence. Even in youth, he carried himself with a confidence that suggested he believed his story would one day matter. By the time he reached adulthood, New York itself was changing. The city's economy shifted. Industries moved. Entire neighborhoods struggled with unemployment and uncertainty. In environments where legal opportunity shrinks, illegal systems often expand. Organized crime did not appear suddenly, it grew because conditions allowed it to take root. Crime families offered something that felt, on the surface, like stability, rules, structure, brotherhood, protection. For young men who felt invisible in mainstream society, that promise could be powerful. But beneath the surface, the cost was always higher than it appeared. John Gotti stepped deeper into that world during these years of transition. At first, his role was small. He followed instructions, observed carefully, learned how influence actually worked not through noise, but through relationships and reputation. In organized crime, patience often mattered more than aggression. The men who lasted longest were those who understood timing. Still, Gotti's personality never fully blended into the background. He dressed sharply, spoke boldly, took pride in appearance and image. While others preferred secrecy, he seemed drawn to visibility. This contrast would later define both his rise and his downfall. Law enforcement agencies during this era faced growing challenges. Traditional policing methods struggled against criminal networks, built on silence and loyalty. Witnesses rarely spoke. Evidence disappeared. Cases collapsed in courtrooms where fear lingered quietly in the air. Investigators needed time, sometimes years, to build cases strong enough to challenge powerful figures. But in the early stages of John Gotti's journey, none of that. Future pressure felt real. What felt real was momentum. Each successful risk created confidence. Each connection opened another door. Step by step, he moved closer to the inner circles of influence that shaped organized crime in New York. Yet history shows a consistent truth. Rapid rises often carry hidden cracks. The same ambition that fuels success can also invite exposure. The same confidence that inspires loyalty can slowly become overconfidence. And in worlds built on secrecy, attention is rarely harmless. For now, though, John Gotti was still climbing, still learning, still proving himself to men who measured worth through discipline and results rather than dreams. The transformation from neighborhood troublemaker to recognized figure inside organized crime did not happen overnight. It unfolded through choices, some calculated, some reckless, that gradually reshaped the course of his life. Beyond the streets where his reputation grew, millions of ordinary Americans continued living unaware of the story forming in the shadows. Parents worked long hours to support families. Children chased ordinary dreams. Most people would never meet a crime boss or witness organized crime directly. And yet, decisions made in hidden rooms could still ripple outward, affecting businesses, unions, and entire communities. This distance between appearance and reality became one of the defining themes of John Gotti's life. To some, he would later appear charismatic, even glamorous. To others, he represented intimidation and harm hidden behind expensive suits and confident smiles. The truth, as history often reveals, was far more complicated than any single image. What cannot be denied is that his name would eventually spread far beyond Brooklyn. Newspapers would print it. Television would repeat it. Courtrooms would surround it with tension and expectation. Few figures in American crime history would ever become as publicly recognized. But in this beginning moment, before headlines, before trials, before the world learned the nickname Teflon Don, John Gotti was simply a man moving step by step toward a future he could not fully see. And like many stories rooted in ambition and power, the path forward would not only shape his destiny, it would also test the strength of the very system determined to stop men like him. The rise had begun quietly. The consequences had not yet arrived. In the crowded neighborhoods of Brooklyn during the 1950s and early 1960s, life moved at a relentless pace. Families shared tight living spaces. Children played in narrow streets, lined with aging brick buildings, and survival often depended on resilience more than comfort. The American dream felt close enough to imagine, yet distant enough to remain uncertain for many immigrant households trying to build stability from almost nothing. For young men growing up in this environment, identity formed quickly. Respect was earned through toughness, loyalty, and the ability to navigate a world where opportunities were unevenly distributed. School could offer a path forward, but the streets offered something more: immediate recognition, influence, and a sense of belonging that felt powerful to those searching for direction. John Gotti absorbed these lessons early. Structure and discipline held little appeal for him, while confidence and boldness seemed to open doors. He watched carefully, studying the behavior of older figures who carried themselves with quiet authority. These men did not appear rushed or uncertain. They moved with patience, spoke with intention, and commanded attention without asking for it. To an ambitious teenager, that presence looked like success. Small decisions began shaping a larger pattern. Time spent outside classrooms increased. Time spent learning the informal rules of the neighborhood grew longer. Friendships formed around shared defiance rather than shared goals. What seemed like harmless rebellion slowly hardened into routine behavior that edged closer to real danger. Yet reputation in the streets was never built on recklessness alone. It required calculation. Knowing when to act, when to stay silent, and when to show loyalty mattered more than momentary bravado. Gotti demonstrated an instinct for these unwritten rules. He paid attention. He remembered faces, favors, and grudges. In environments where memory could mean survival, that awareness became valuable. Economic uncertainty across New York created conditions where underground systems expanded quietly. Legal businesses struggled. Labor tensions grew. Entire industries shifted or disappeared. Whenever instability spreads, parallel structures often emerge to fill the gaps, offering protection, employment, or influence outside traditional law. Organized crime thrived in these gray spaces, presenting itself as order within chaos. To outsiders, this hidden network looked mysterious. To those living nearby, it could feel ordinary. Certain social clubs became gathering places. Certain names carried weight. Conversations lowered in volume when unfamiliar ears approached. Everyone understood more than they openly discussed. John Gotti moved gradually closer to these circles, not through sudden promotion, but through persistence. Running errands, delivering messages, demonstrating reliability in small matters before being trusted with larger ones. Advancement required patience, and patience demanded discipline, qualities he learned to adopt, even while maintaining his natural boldness. Appearance also played a role in perception. Clean clothes, confident posture, and careful speech signaled seriousness. In communities where pride mattered deeply, presentation became a form of language. Gotti understood that image could influence how others judged strength or weakness long before words were exchanged. Encounters with law enforcement were not uncommon for young men walking this path. Minor arrests, brief detentions, warnings that hinted at more serious consequences ahead. Each interaction revealed how thin the line had become between temporary trouble and permanent record. Some individuals stepped back at this point, choosing safer directions. Others continued forward, convinced they could outmaneuver risk. Confidence can feel like protection when consequences remain distant. But the justice system, though sometimes slow, rarely forgets patterns. Investigators observed neighborhoods carefully, documenting names that appeared repeatedly. Even when evidence was insufficient for major charges, attention quietly accumulated, files grew thicker. Interest deepened. Inside the criminal world, advancement demanded proof of loyalty above everything else. Trust was not given freely, because betrayal carried enormous cost. Those seeking acceptance had to demonstrate commitment through actions rather than promises. This expectation created moral crossroads, moments where personal conscience collided with the desire for belonging. For John Gotti, ambition consistently outweighed hesitation. Each step forward strengthened his ties to a life that offered influence but limited escape. The deeper he moved, the narrower the path back to ordinary anonymity became. Still, success within that system brought rewards that felt meaningful in the moment. Recognition from powerful figures, financial gain, and the intoxicating sense of control. Meanwhile, New York City continued evolving. Political debates intensified. Social movements reshaped public conversation. Crime rates fluctuated, drawing increasing attention from government agencies determined to restore order. Strategies within law enforcement slowly modernized, shifting from reactive policing toward long-term investigations, targeting entire organizations rather than individual crimes. These changes remained mostly invisible at street level. Daily life still revolved around familiar routines: family dinners, neighborhood arguments, celebrations, and struggles shared among people living close together. Within this ordinary rhythm, extraordinary stories quietly unfolded, rarely noticed until consequences became impossible to ignore. Gotti's growing reputation reflected a contradiction that would define much of his future. He could appear charismatic and approachable, yet also intimidating. Loyal to friends, yet capable of ruthless decisions. Confident in public, yet operating inside a world governed by secrecy. Such duality often surrounds figures who rise within organized crime, where personal charm and calculated danger exist side by side. Time moved forward without pause. Youth gradually gave way to adulthood. Choices once dismissed as temporary began shaping permanent identity. The question was no longer whether John Gotti would remain connected to the criminal underworld, but how far he would climb within it, and what price that climb would eventually demand. History shows that environments do not excuse decisions, but they do influence them. Poverty, limited opportunity, and social pressure can push individuals toward risky paths. Yet responsibility ultimately belongs to the person choosing each step. This truth would echo repeatedly through the years ahead, not only for Gotti, but for everyone affected by the world he helped shape. For now, the streets of Brooklyn continued humming with ordinary life, even as unseen tensions gathered beneath the surface. Ambition pushed forward. Law enforcement watched patiently, and the distance between rising power and inevitable consequence slowly began to shrink. The reputation forming around John Gotti was no longer small or local. It was becoming something far more significant, something that would soon reach beyond neighborhood boundaries and enter the wider story of American crime and justice. Ambition rarely announces the exact moment it becomes irreversible. Most lives change gradually, shaped by small decisions that feel temporary at the time. Yet there comes a point when direction hardens into destiny, when turning back grows more difficult than moving forward. For John Gotti, the turning point emerged not through a single dramatic event, but through steady immersion in a world governed by loyalty, secrecy, and power. New York during the 1960s stood at the intersection of transformation and tension. Cultural change moved quickly through music, politics, and social movements, while older neighborhood traditions struggled to maintain their influence. Entire communities balanced between hope for progress and fear of instability. In such uncertain environments, organized crime often presented itself as a structure that promised certainty, rules that did not shift with public opinion, authority that did not depend on elections, and protection that felt immediate rather than distant. To outsiders, this hidden system appeared dangerous and chaotic. To those inside it, the structure felt disciplined. Hierarchies were clear. Expectations were precise. Advancement followed performance and loyalty rather than education or social status for individuals who believed traditional pathways were closed to them. This alternative ladder of success could feel compelling. John Gotti stepped deeper into that structure with increasing confidence. The early tasks that once tested reliability gave way to responsibilities requiring greater trust. Conversations grew more serious. Decisions carried heavier consequences. Association with powerful figures was no longer distant, it became personal. Each new connection strengthened his standing while also tightening the invisible boundaries surrounding his life. Trust within organized crime demanded silence above everything else. Words spoken carelessly could destroy careers or lives. Because of this, observation became more valuable than speech. Gotti demonstrated an ability to read situations quickly, understanding when patience served better than action. This awareness helped him earn recognition from men who measured character through discipline rather than personality. Still, personality remained impossible to hide. He carried natural charisma, a presence that drew attention even in controlled environments. Some viewed this confidence as strength, others saw risk in visibility. Within secretive organizations, standing out could invite both opportunity and danger. The tension between secrecy and recognition would quietly follow him through the years ahead. Financial rewards also increased as involvement deepened. Money arrived faster than it could through ordinary employment, reinforcing the illusion that this path offered stability rather than risk. Yet such wealth rarely came without hidden cost. Illegal income demanded constant vigilance, watching for law enforcement, rival groups, and internal betrayal. Comfort existed beside fear, creating a life where relaxation never fully arrived. Law enforcement agencies across the United States were beginning to understand that organized crime required new investigative strategies. Traditional arrests targeting minor offenses failed to weaken larger structures. Officials slowly shifted toward long-term surveillance, intelligence gathering, and legal tools designed to reach leadership rather than street-level participants. These efforts moved quietly, often unnoticed by those being observed. On the streets, daily routines continued with familiar rhythm. Neighborhood gatherings, family celebrations, and ordinary struggles filled the hours between more serious activities. This blend of normal life and hidden danger created a psychological balance that allowed participants to justify their choices. As long as family bonds remained strong and communities appeared stable, the darker realities felt distant even when they were not. For Gotti, identity became increasingly tied to reputation. Respect from influential figures reinforced his belief that he belonged in this world. Each successful task strengthened confidence. Each avoided consequence encouraged further risk. Momentum replaced hesitation, pushing him toward roles that demanded not just loyalty but leadership. Leadership within organized crime, however, carried burdens rarely visible from the outside. Authority required decision-making that could affect many lives. Conflicts demanded resolution. Discipline had to be enforced. Compassion often became secondary to control. Those unable to balance power with caution rarely remained in position for long. The broad American public during this era saw only fragments of these hidden systems. Newspaper stories hinted at criminal networks. Political hearings raised concerns. Films and television sometimes dramatized the subject, blending truth with fiction. Yet the full reality, complex, secretive, and deeply rooted, remained largely concealed from everyday awareness. Meanwhile, personal transformation continued quietly within John Gotti's life. Youthful rebellion matured into calculated ambition. Emotional reactions gave way to strategic thinking. The desire for recognition evolved into determination to command influence. Such changes rarely feel dramatic from the inside, but over time they reshape character completely. Moral boundaries also shift gradually in environments where illegal behavior becomes normalized. Actions once considered unthinkable begin to appear necessary. Justifications replace doubts. Loyalty to group identity overrides personal conscience. History repeatedly shows how easily human judgment adapts when surrounded by constant reinforcement. Yet consequences never disappear, they only wait. Investigators gathering information across years began connecting names, patterns, and relationships. Quiet observations accumulated into structured understanding. While public attention focused elsewhere, foundations for future prosecution slowly formed. Time, Patience and persistence became the most powerful tools available to those determined to challenge organized crime. Inside the criminal world, awareness of surveillance created its own tension. Meetings grew more cautious. Communication became coded. Suspicion lingered even among allies. Trust remained essential, yet absolute trust became increasingly rare. This atmosphere demanded constant alertness, turning everyday existence into a careful performance. For Gotti, rising influence brought both admiration and scrutiny. Supporters viewed him as dependable and bold. Rivals measured his ambition carefully. Superiors evaluated whether confidence would remain controlled or grow unpredictable. Advancement depended not only on strength, but on the perception of stability. The line between opportunity and danger narrowed with each passing year. Success invited visibility. Visibility attracted investigation. Investigation threatened everything built so far. Still, retreat no longer seemed possible. The path forward, however uncertain, had become the only direction left. Across New York City, millions continued living ordinary lives untouched by these hidden struggles. Children attended school, workers commuted to jobs, families planned hopeful futures. The contrast between public normalcy and private criminal networks illustrated a powerful truth. History often unfolds unseen until a single moment forces it into the open. That moment had not yet arrived, but forces were already moving toward collision, ambition pushing upward, law enforcement closing inward, and destiny forming somewhere between them. John Gotti was no longer just a participant learning the rules. He was becoming a figure whose choices would soon influence far more than his own future. And once influence reaches that scale, the story rarely remains quiet for long. Respect can be one of the most powerful currencies in any human system. Unlike money, it cannot be printed or borrowed. Unlike titles, it cannot simply be handed down. It must be earned slowly, protected constantly, and defended when challenged. In environments shaped by secrecy and hierarchy, respect often determines who rises, who survives, and who disappears without warning. Across New York City in the late 1960s and early 1970s, organized crime families operated through structures that resembled disciplined institutions more than chaotic gangs. Roles were defined. Authority flowed downward in clear lines. Decisions made at the top carried consequences for everyone below. Loyalty served as the foundation holding the entire system together. Without loyalty, silence would break. Without silence, power would collapse. John Gotti moved through this structure with growing confidence. The responsibilities placed in his hands were no longer small or temporary. Expectations increased, and with them came scrutiny. Those who observed him closely were not only measuring strength, but also patience, judgment, and the ability to maintain control under pressure. Advancement required more than boldness. It demanded reliability in moments when mistakes could not be undone. Daily life within this world followed rhythms invisible to outsiders. Meetings took place in familiar social spaces that appeared ordinary to passing strangers. Conversations were brief, deliberate, and often indirect. Messages traveled through trusted intermediaries rather than open discussion. Every action reflected awareness that attention from rivals or from law enforcement could arrive at any time. Trust, once earned, created opportunity. Gotti demonstrated an ability to carry out instructions without hesitation while also understanding the broader purpose behind them. This balance between obedience and awareness distinguished individuals capable of leadership from those destined to remain followers. Superiors began to see not just usefulness in him, but potential. Potential, however, always carries risk. A rising figure attracts admiration from allies and suspicion from competitors. Envy can grow quietly inside organizations where ambition is common but advancement is limited. Maintaining position requires careful navigation of personalities as much as successful execution of responsibilities. Strength alone rarely guarantees safety. At the same time, law enforcement strategies continued evolving. Investigators studied patterns rather than isolated crimes. Surveillance technology improved. Legal frameworks expanded to allow prosecution of coordinated criminal activity rather than single offenses. These developments unfolded gradually, often unnoticed by the very individuals they targeted. Patience on one side met confidence on the other, creating a slow and inevitable convergence. Financial rewards within organized crime could appear impressive from the outside. Cash moved quickly. Luxury seemed attainable. Status symbols signaled success. Yet behind this appearance stood constant instability. Income depended on a legal systems vulnerable to disruption. Freedom depended on avoiding attention. Security depended on the continued silence of many people, any one of whom could become a weakness. Family life introduced another layer of complexity. Many individuals involved in crime maintained deep personal bonds, caring for children, spouses, and relatives with genuine devotion. This dual existence, loving protector at home, feared operator in the streets, created emotional contradictions difficult to reconcile. The desire to provide stability for loved ones often became a justification for choices that ultimately endangered them. For Gotti, identity increasingly blended personal pride with organizational loyalty. Respect from powerful figures reinforced a sense of purpose. Public confidence masked private pressure. Each new level of responsibility required stronger discipline, yet also brought him closer to decisions with permanent consequences. Leadership in such environments rarely allows retreat. Once authority grows, expectations grow with it. Reputation spread beyond immediate circles. His name began carrying weight in conversations where influence mattered. Some spoke of his confidence with admiration. Others noted the risks created by visibility in a world designed for secrecy. Attention can strengthen power, but it can also illuminate vulnerability. The balance between presence and discretion remained delicate. Meanwhile, broader American society was entering a period of questioning authority and redefining social norms. Public trust in institutions shifted. Media coverage of crime increased. Political leaders promised stronger action against organized criminal networks. Pressure built slowly, but steadily, toward confrontation between hidden systems and visible law. Inside criminal organizations, awareness of this pressure produced mixed reactions. Some leaders urged caution, reducing exposure and avoiding unnecessary conflict. Others believed strength required boldness, demonstrating control rather than retreat. These differing philosophies quietly shaped future events, influencing decisions whose consequences would reach far beyond private meetings. Gotti's natural confidence aligned more closely with boldness than caution. He carried himself with assurance that projected control, a quality admired by supporters but carefully watched by superiors. Leadership demanded not only courage, but also restraint, the ability to act decisively without drawing destructive attention. Whether such balance could be maintained remained an open question. Time has a way of revealing truths hidden by momentum. Success achieved quickly often conceals structural weakness. Systems built on fear may appear stable until loyalty fractures. Individuals driven by ambition may overlook limits until consequences arrive suddenly. History repeats these lessons across generations, though few recognize them, while living inside the moment. Communities surrounding organized crime often experience conflicting emotions. Some residents appreciated the sense of order imposed by powerful figures. Others feared the violence and corruption linked to their influence. Many simply tried to live ordinary lives, avoiding involvement altogether. This silent majority rarely appeared in headlines, yet they felt the impact of decisions made in secrecy. Law enforcement continued assembling cases piece by piece, understanding that dismantling entrenched organizations required endurance rather than speed. Informants, surveillance, financial records, and legal innovation slowly combined into stronger strategies. The process demanded years of work, often without visible progress. Still, persistence remained the only path toward lasting results. For those rising within the criminal hierarchy, the future seemed defined by expansion, greater influence, greater wealth, greater recognition. Yet expansion also meant exposure. The higher a figure climbed, the fewer places remained to hide. Power concentrates attention just as surely as it concentrates authority. John Gotti stood at a point where respect had been earned, but ultimate destiny remained unwritten. The qualities that fueled his rise, confidence, loyalty, boldness, would soon face tests more severe than anything before. Whether those qualities would secure lasting control or accelerate downfall depended on choices still waiting ahead. In worlds governed by secrecy, change often arrives without warning. A single decision can shift balance. A single conflict can ignite consequences. A single moment can transform reputation into legend or into cautionary tale. The pursuit of respect had carried him far. What remained uncertain was how much it would ultimately cost. Cities are living organisms, constantly reshaping themselves through economic shifts, cultural movements, and the quiet decisions of millions of people trying to build better lives. New York in the 1970s carried both exhaustion and resilience in equal measure. Financial uncertainty strained public services, neighborhoods struggled with rising crime, and trust in institutions felt fragile. Yet beneath the hardship, the city's relentless energy never disappeared. Opportunity still existed, but it often demanded a price. In environments where legitimate systems weaken, alternative structures tend to grow stronger. Organized crime did not create the city's problems, but it learned to operate within them. Where businesses feared instability, criminal groups offered protection. Where labor disputes created tension, hidden influence promised resolution. These arrangements blurred moral lines, allowing illegal power to appear useful, even necessary, to those seeking immediate solutions. John Gotti moved deeper into this complicated landscape with a sense of purpose shaped by years of experience. Ambition had matured into expectation. Success was no longer something he hoped for, it was something he believed he deserved. Confidence guided his decisions, reinforcing the idea that control over circumstances could be achieved through bold action rather than patience alone. Reputation within organized crime depends on consistency. Allies must believe that promises will be kept. Superiors must trust that instructions will be carried out. Rivals must recognize strength strong enough to discourage challenge. Maintaining this balance requires constant awareness, because a single perceived weakness can invite consequences that spread quickly through tightly connected networks. The responsibilities surrounding Gotti continued expanding. Influence reached into business dealings, social relationships, and territorial boundaries where authority had to be protected. Each decision carried ripple effects beyond immediate outcomes. Leadership, even at intermediate levels, demanded strategic thinking, anticipating reactions before they occurred and controlling situations before they escalated. At the same time, visibility around him increased. Confidence in public settings projected power, but it also created a tension that secrecy-based systems typically avoided. Some observers admired the boldness. Others questioned whether such openness could remain sustainable in a world where survival often depended on remaining unseen. The tension between image and security grew more pronounced with every passing year. Law enforcement agencies were adapting quietly but steadily. Investigators understood that dismantling criminal organizations required understanding their financial networks, communication patterns, and internal hierarchies. Surveillance expanded beyond physical observation into analysis of money flow and associations. Legal strategies evolved to hold leaders accountable for actions carried out by entire groups rather than isolated individuals. Progress remained slow, but determination strengthened. For individuals rising within organized crime, daily life demanded emotional control. Fear could not be displayed. Doubt could not be voiced openly. Decisions had to appear confident even when uncertainty existed. This constant performance created psychological pressure rarely visible to outsiders. Power looked glamorous from a distance, yet up close it required unending vigilance. Family relationships continued providing moments of normalcy. Shared meals, celebrations, and private conversations offered temporary escape from the demands of criminal life. Many participants convinced themselves that these personal bonds justified everything else, that providing comfort for loved ones outweighed the risks created by illegal activity. Such reasoning felt convincing in quiet moments, even when reality suggested otherwise. Communities surrounding organized crime lived within complicated emotional landscapes. Some residents believed powerful figures maintained order where government presence felt weak. Others experienced fear, understanding that violence could emerge without warning. Most people simply focused on survival, working long hours, raising children, and hoping instability would eventually fade. Their stories rarely appeared in headlines, yet they formed the true foundation of the city's endurance. Gotti's growing influence brought him closer to individuals holding significant authority. Conversations shifted from routine matters toward long-term strategy. Trust deepened, but expectations intensified as well. Advancement at higher levels required more than execution, it required vision. Leaders had to anticipate changes within both the criminal world and the legal system, determined to challenge it. Ambition, when constantly rewarded, can begin to feel limitless. Each achievement reinforces belief in personal destiny. Caution becomes harder to maintain. Risks appear manageable rather than dangerous. History repeatedly shows how success can quietly transform into overconfidence, especially in environments where opposition seems distant or ineffective. Yet opposition was not absent. Investigations continued building quietly across years. Informants provided fragments of information. Financial irregularities raised questions. Patterns of association formed clearer pictures. Though public attention remained inconsistent, institutional memory within law enforcement never disappeared. Patience remained their greatest advantage. Inside organized crime, awareness of potential surveillance influenced behavior. Meetings became more controlled. Communication relied increasingly on trust rather than convenience. Suspicion occasionally surfaced, reminding participants that betrayal could come from unexpected places. Living under such pressure required emotional resilience that few could sustain indefinitely. For Gotti, identity and ambition had become inseparable. Respect gained from powerful figures reinforced his sense of direction. Challenges strengthened determination rather than discouraging it. The possibility of retreat into ordinary anonymity grew more distant with each passing year. Forward movement felt inevitable, even when the future remained uncertain. New York itself continued evolving, shaped by political reform, economic recovery efforts, and renewed public focus on safety. Government agencies sought stronger tools to combat organized crime. Media coverage increased public awareness. Gradually, the hidden world that once operated in near invisibility faced brighter and more persistent scrutiny. Moments of transition often arrive quietly before revealing their significance. Decisions made during such periods can determine whether rising figures secure lasting power or step unknowingly toward collapse. The difference between triumph and downfall may rest on a single choice, one conversation, one act of boldness, one failure to recognize changing reality. The weight of ambition continued pressing forward, carrying promise as well as danger. Success seemed closer than ever, yet stability remained fragile. Power once pursued rarely allows peaceful surrender, and the higher one climbs, the more severe the fall can become. John Gotti stood within that fragile balance, driven by confidence, surrounded by expectation, and moving steadily toward a future that would soon demand far more than ambition alone. The city around him kept changing, so did the forces preparing to challenge everything he had built. Power rarely arrives with a clear announcement. More often it grows quietly, taking shape through reputation, relationships, and the steady accumulation of influence over time. Those closest to it may not immediately recognize how far they have climbed, while those watching from a distance begin to sense a shift, long before it becomes visible to the wider world. In New York's underworld during the late 1970s and early 1980s, such quiet transformation was already underway. John Gotti's presence within organized crime circles had evolved beyond simple participation. His name now carried expectation. Conversations included him not out of courtesy, but because decisions increasingly required his approval or involvement. Influence of this kind is never accidental. It forms when confidence, loyalty, and opportunity intersect at exactly the right moment. Yet the same forces that create influence can also attract pressure strong enough to test its limits. Inside hierarchical criminal organizations, advancement changes relationships. Former peers begin to treat a rising figure with caution. Superiors observe more closely, measuring whether ambition remains aligned with discipline. Rivals, even silent ones, evaluate vulnerabilities that might be exploited if balance shifts. Leadership becomes less about personal success and more about managing the emotions and expectations of everyone nearby. Gotti's natural charisma continued shaping how others perceived him. He spoke with certainty, dressed with visible pride, and projected the image of someone unafraid of attention. For supporters, this confidence symbolized strength in a world where hesitation could be dangerous. For more cautious observers, however, visibility carried risk. Organized crime traditionally depended on shadows, not spotlights. The contrast between secrecy and public presence created tension that few openly discussed. Beyond personal reputation, broader structural pressures were building. Law enforcement agencies had spent years refining investigative methods designed specifically to confront organized criminal networks. Surveillance technology improved. Legal strategies expanded. Cooperation between different levels of government strengthened. These developments did not produce immediate headlines, but they quietly altered the balance of power. Financial operations within organized crime also grew more complex. Money flowed through businesses designed to appear legitimate, creating layers of separation between illegal activity and public visibility. Managing these systems required careful coordination and constant awareness of potential exposure. Mistakes could trigger investigations capable of unraveling entire networks built across decades. For individuals rising within this environment, daily life demanded constant calculation. Every meeting location, every conversation, every visible association carried potential consequence. Freedom existed, but it was conditional, dependent on secrecy, loyalty, and the continued silence of many people whose motivations could change without warning. Living under such conditions required emotional endurance that few outside the world could fully understand. Family remained one of the few spaces offering temporary relief from pressure. Moments spent with loved ones created the illusion of normal life, even when danger lingered just beyond the front door. Many participants convinced themselves that their actions served a protective purpose, ensuring comfort and stability for those they cared about most. Yet history repeatedly shows that the risks attached to criminal power often reach families first when consequences finally arrive. Communities surrounding organized crime continued navigating complex realities. Some residents benefited indirectly from the order imposed by powerful figures. Others feared violence or corruption hidden beneath that order. Most focused simply on survival, holding jobs, raising children, and hoping the future would offer greater security than the present. Their quiet endurance formed a stark contrast to the dramatic struggles unfolding nearby. Within organized crime leadership, differing philosophies about the future began to surface. Some believed long-term survival required reducing visibility, avoiding unnecessary confrontation, and adapting to increased law enforcement pressure. Others viewed strength as inseparable from boldness, arguing that authority must be demonstrated openly to prevent challenges. These competing visions shaped strategic decisions whose consequences would extend far beyond private discussions. Gotti's instincts leaned toward visibility and confidence rather than retreat. He appeared comfortable standing at the center of attention, believing control could be maintained through strength of personality as much as through secrecy. This approach inspired loyalty among supporters who admired decisive leadership. At the same time, it created unease among those who feared that attention might invite forces impossible to control. Investigators observing organized crime structures recognized that internal tension could become as significant as external pressure. Rivalries, disagreements, and ambition often weakened organizations more effectively than arrests alone. Patience remained essential. Instead of rushing toward premature action, law enforcement continued gathering evidence capable of producing lasting legal impact. The strategy required years, but history suggested it would eventually succeed. Public awareness of organized crime fluctuated during this period. News stories appeared, then faded. Political speeches promised reform, then shifted focus. Popular culture sometimes portrayed criminal figures with dramatic intensity, blurring lines between reality and entertainment. Yet beneath these changing narratives, real investigations continued moving forward with quiet determination. For Gotti, the intersection of ambition and expectation created a defining moment. Influence had reached a level where future direction mattered more than past achievement. Every decision carried amplified consequence. Every risk offered potential reward, but also irreversible danger. Leadership no longer meant proving strength, it meant sustaining power within an environment designed to challenge it constantly. Time has always moved without pause. Opportunities emerged alongside threats. Allies remained loyal, and circumstances tested that loyalty. Confidence provided momentum. Yet momentum alone could not guarantee control. The forces shaping the future were becoming larger than any single individual, no matter how determined. New York itself was entering a period of gradual renewal. Economic recovery efforts, political reforms, and shifting public attitudes began changing the city's trajectory. As legitimate institutions strengthened, tolerance for organized crime weakened. Pressure that once felt distant began moving closer, narrowing the space in which hidden power could operate safely. Rising influence often feels like victory in the moment it is achieved. Only later does it reveal the responsibilities and dangers attached to it. The higher one stands, the more visible every movement becomes. And visibility, once unavoidable, transforms power into a target as much as a shield. John Gotti stood within that transformation, no longer merely climbing, but now holding a position where the next step would determine everything that followed. Confidence remained strong. Support remained present. Opportunity seemed near, yet unseen forces were already gathering strength, preparing to test whether rising influence could withstand the full weight of consequence. The quiet ascent was nearing a turning point. And turning points once reached rarely allow a return to what existed before. Power inside secretive organizations rarely shifts through public announcement or formal ceremony. Instead, it moves in silence through private decisions, guarded conversations, and actions understood clearly only by those closest to the center. When authority changes in such environments, the consequences can reshape entire structures overnight, even while the outside world remains unaware that anything has happened at all. New York in the mid-1980s stood at a fragile crossroads. The city was slowly recovering from years of financial crisis and social instability, yet uncertainty still lingered in many neighborhoods. Law enforcement pressure on organized crime had intensified, creating tension within criminal hierarchies that depended on stability and control. Leaders understood that survival required careful balance between visibility and secrecy, strength and restraint. Within this atmosphere of pressure and expectation, internal disagreements began to carry greater weight. Differing visions about leadership style, risk tolerance, and the future direction of influence created quiet divisions. Such divisions are rarely harmless. In organizations built on loyalty, conflict at the top can send shockwaves through every level below. John Gotti's position had grown strong enough that his choices now mattered far beyond personal ambition. Supporters viewed him as decisive and fearless, qualities admired in environments where hesitation could be interpreted as weakness. Others saw danger in bold visibility at a time when discretion might have offered greater protection. These opposing perceptions created an invisible tension surrounding his rise. Moments that alter history often appear sudden from the outside, yet they are usually the result of long-building pressure beneath the surface. Private frustrations, strategic calculations, and shifting alliances gradually form conditions where dramatic change becomes possible. When that moment finally arrives, it feels immediate, but in truth, it has been approaching for years. A decisive turning point emerged when leadership within the organization faced a direct and irreversible challenge. Authority that once seemed permanent proved vulnerable. The event was swift, leaving behind shock, uncertainty, and a vacuum that demanded immediate resolution. In hidden worlds governed by hierarchy, power cannot remain unclaimed for long. Someone must step forward, or instability spreads. Gotti stepped into that vacuum with confidence that appeared unshaken. To support us, this move represented strength and clarity at a time when confusion could have weakened the entire structure. To critics, it signaled a willingness to embrace risk on a scale that might invite consequences impossible to control. Both interpretations contained elements of truth, reflecting the complicated nature of leadership gained through confrontation rather than consensus. The transition of authority reshaped relationships instantly. Individuals who had once been equals now became subordinates. Loyalty had to be reaffirmed, sometimes quietly, sometimes with unmistakable clarity. Maintaining unity after such a dramatic shift required not only strength, but also careful management of perception. Every action taken in the days that followed carried symbolic meaning. Public awareness of these events remained limited at first. Ordinary life across New York continued with familiar rhythm, commuters filling trains, businesses opening each morning, families focused on daily responsibilities. Yet beneath this surface normalcy, the balance of power inside one of the city's most influential criminal organizations had changed permanently. Law enforcement agencies reacted with heightened attention. Investigators understood that leadership transitions often create instability capable of revealing hidden information. Surveillance intensified. Intelligence gathering accelerated. Authorities recognized that moments of internal disruption could provide rare opportunities to challenge structures that otherwise remained sealed by loyalty and silence. For Gotti, holding power required more than seizing it. Authority had to be stabilized, alliances reinforced, and potential opposition managed carefully. Leadership within organized crime demanded constant vigilance because threats could emerge from rivals, investigators, or even shifting loyalty among insiders. Confidence alone could not secure survival. Strategy became essential. Visibility surrounding him increased dramatically. Media interest grew as rumors and reports circulated about changing leadership within the underworld. Attention that once focused quietly within criminal circles now began spreading outward into public conversation. This exposure carried both advantage and danger. Recognition could strengthen reputation, that it could also attract scrutiny impossible to avoid. Supporters admired the boldness of a leader who appeared unafraid of public presence. They believed strength displayed openly could discourage both internal rebellion and external challenge. Critics worried that such visibility might provoke exactly the kind of pressure that secrecy had long prevented. The debate between boldness and caution continued quietly, even as events moved forward. Communities connected indirectly to organized crime sensed subtle change without always understanding its source. Shifts in influence affected businesses, labor relationships, and neighborhood dynamics in ways difficult to trace. For many residents, life simply felt different, tense in ways not easily explained, as though unseen forces had begun rearranging familiar patterns. Family life for those at the center of power became increasingly complicated. Greater authority meant greater risk, and risk rarely remains contained. Loved ones shared the benefits of status, yet they also lived closer to potential danger. The emotional burden of protecting family while navigating constant threat created pressure that few outside the world could fully comprehend. Meanwhile, law enforcement prepared for long-term confrontation rather than immediate victory. Investigators understood that dismantling powerful leadership required patience, evidence, and precise legal strategy. Public attention might rise and fall, but institutional determination remained steady. The conflict between hidden authority and visible justice was entering a new phase. Holding power can feel like triumph in the moment it is achieved. Yet history repeatedly shows that the manner in which power is gained often shapes the challenges that follow. Authority born from confrontation must continually defend itself. Stability achieved through bold action must withstand equally bold response. Every decision made after such a turning point carries amplified consequence. John Gotti now stood at the center of influence he had pursued for years. The climb was over. Leadership had arrived. From the outside, it might have appeared like victory, confidence rewarded, ambition fulfilled, destiny realized. But power at that level is never an ending. It is only the beginning of a far more dangerous test, because once authority becomes visible, the forces determined to challenge it no longer remain hidden. They move closer, they grow stronger, and eventually they demand an answer that no leader can avoid forever. Power that once lived quietly in the shadows had now stepped into public awareness. What had been whispered in private rooms began appearing in headlines, discussed in newsrooms, and debated in conversations far removed from the streets where the story first began. Visibility transformed influence into spectacle, and spectacle carried consequences no amount of confidence could fully control. New York during the height of the 1980s was a city redefining itself. Energy pulsed through finance, media, and culture with renewed intensity. Bright lights, bold ambition, and the promise of success shaped the public imagination. Yet alongside this revival existed another narrative, one centered on crime, corruption, and the figures who seemed to operate above ordinary law. The contrast between prosperity and danger created fascination, and fascination quickly turned certain individuals into symbols larger than life. John Gotti became one of those symbols. His presence in public spaces drew attention in ways uncommon for someone leading a secretive criminal organization. Carefully tailored suits, confident posture, and an unmistakable sense of self-assurance created an image that cameras found irresistible. Supporters viewed this visibility as proof of strength. Critics saw recklessness. Either way, the spotlight had arrived, and it showed no sign of fading. Media coverage intensified the transformation from hidden figure to public personality. Court appearances, legal battles, and rumors of influence became recurring stories. Reporters searched for meaning behind every gesture, every expression, every moment of apparent calm. The nickname that would define his public identity, suggesting an ability to avoid conviction, spread rapidly, reinforcing the perception that he possessed unusual protection from consequence. Public fascination with powerful criminal figures has deep historical roots. Stories of rebellion, control, and defiance against authority often captured imagination, especially during times of social change. Yet fascination can blur moral clarity, turning real harm into distant drama. Behind every dramatic headline remained communities affected by violence, intimidation, and corruption, realities far less glamorous than the image presented on television screens. For Gotti, attention created both opportunity and danger. Recognition strengthened reputation among supporters who admired visible confidence. At the same time, scrutiny from law enforcement intensified. Investigators understood that public visibility could reveal patterns previously hidden. Surveillance expanded. Legal strategies sharpened. Every appearance in court or in public became another moment for authorities to observe carefully. Confidence in the face of accusation contributed to an aura of invincibility. When charges failed to produce conviction, the perception of untouchable power grew stronger. Supporters interpreted legal victories as proof of superiority. Opponents saw temporary setbacks in a much longer struggle. Reality existed somewhere between these extremes, shaped by complex legal processes, rather than simple triumph or defeat. Inside organized crime, reactions to such visibility were mixed. Some believed public recognition strengthened authority, discouraging rivals and reinforcing loyalty. Others feared that constant attention would eventually invite overwhelming pressure. Secretive systems survive through invisibility. Prolonged exposure threatens their foundation. The debate between pride and caution continued quietly behind closed doors. Family members living close to public scrutiny experienced a different kind of pressure. Ordinary routines, walking outside, attending events, interacting with neighbors now unfolded beneath watchful eyes. Privacy diminished. Safety concerns increased. The emotional weight of constant attention extended beyond the individual at the center, touching everyone connected to him. Meanwhile, law enforcement agencies remained patient. High-profile cases often required years of preparation, gathering evidence strong enough to withstand intense legal challenge. Investigators studied communication patterns, financial structures, and internal relationships, searching for weaknesses that visibility might expose. Time once again became their greatest ally. Communities across New York responded to the growing spectacle in varied ways. Some residents followed the story with curiosity, treating it like ongoing drama. Others felt frustration, believing attention distracted from deeper social issues affecting everyday life. Many simply hoped for stability, wanting safe streets and honest opportunity rather than headlines filled with crime. The illusion of invincibility can be one of the most dangerous forces surrounding power. When success repeats without immediate consequence, caution often fades. Risks begin to feel manageable. Warnings seem exaggerated. Confidence, once useful, slowly transforms into overconfidence. History offers countless examples of leaders undone not by sudden weakness, but by prolonged belief in their own immunity. For Gotti, the balance between image and reality grew increasingly fragile. Public strength masked private vulnerability. Legal victories did not erase ongoing investigation. Admiration from supporters did not eliminate internal tension. Beneath the surface of confidence, pressure continued building quietly, waiting for the moment when perception and reality would finally collide. Media fascination also carried unintended consequences. By turning a criminal leader into a public personality, attention risked normalizing behavior that deserved condemnation rather than celebration. This tension highlighted an enduring challenge within society: how to report truth without creating myth, how to inform without glorifying harm. The responsibility extended beyond journalists to audiences themselves. As years passed, the gap between appearance and inevitability narrowed. Investigations deepened. Strategies matured. The patience of law enforcement moved steadily toward action, even when progress remained invisible to the public. What looked like endless victory from the outside was, in truth, a temporary phase within a much longer story. Power surrounded by fame can feel permanent. Fear hidden beneath confidence can feel distant. Yet neither illusion lasts forever. Reality waits with quiet persistence, advancing step by step until the moment arrives when no image, no reputation, and no nickname can hold it back. John Gotti stood at the peak of visibility, recognized, discussed, and watched more closely than ever before. The world saw confidence. Supporters saw strength. Investigators saw opportunity, and somewhere beyond the cameras and headlines, the next turning point was already beginning to form, one that would test whether the illusion of invincibility could survive the full force of truth. From a distance, power can appear smooth and unshakable, like polished stone untouched by time. Yet even the strongest surfaces often hide fractures forming slowly underneath. Pressure builds quietly, small weaknesses widen, and when the moment of strain finally arrives, what once looked permanent can begin to break with surprising speed. Public confidence surrounding John Gotti remained strong through much of the late 1980s. Courtroom appearances ended without the outcomes many expected. Supporters interpreted each legal escape as confirmation that his authority extended beyond ordinary limits. Stories circulated about influence, loyalty, and strategy powerful enough to defeat any challenge. The image of untouchable control became part of popular imagination, repeated often enough that it began to feel like fact. But beneath that image, reality moved differently. Law enforcement agencies had not stopped their efforts, instead had adapted. Years of experience taught investigators that rushing toward visible confrontation often produced failure. Real progress required patience measured not in weeks or months but in years. Evidence had to be gathered piece by piece, quietly and methodically, until the full structure of criminal activity could be presented in a way the legal system could not ignore. This slow strategy began producing results invisible to the public eye. Surveillance improved. Communication patterns were studied more closely. Financial records revealed connections once hidden behind layers of secrecy. Informants, rare but powerful, provided insight into conversations never meant to be heard outside trusted circles. None of these developments created immediate headlines, but together they formed a growing foundation of truth. Inside organized crime, the atmosphere shifted in subtle ways. Confidence still existed, but tension crept in around the edges. Increased investigation meant increased caution. Meetings required more planning. Conversations carried hints of suspicion. Loyalty remained essential, yet absolute certainty about loyalty became harder to maintain. In worlds built on secrecy, doubt can spread silently, influencing behavior long before anyone speaks it aloud. Leadership under such conditions demands emotional control stronger than ever. A single sign of fear can weaken authority. A single mistake can invite challenge. Gotti continued projecting calm confidence in public, maintaining the image supporters expected to see. But leadership at that level often involves private burdens invisible to the outside world, constant awareness that danger may already be closer than it appears. Media attention, once beneficial to reputation, began creating complications. Visibility allowed investigators to observe patterns more easily. Public appearances generated records of movement and association. Words spoken confidently in one moment could later be examined under entirely different circumstances. Fame, which once seemed like protection, slowly transformed into exposure. Communities watching these events unfold experienced mixed emotions. Some still viewed powerful criminal figures through a lens shaped by fascination or myth. Others grew weary of violence, corruption, and instability tied to organized crime. Many hoped the legal system would eventually restore balance, proving that no individual stood above the law. This quiet hope rarely made headlines, yet it represented the deeper desire of ordinary citizens seeking safety and fairness. Within the criminal organization itself, maintaining unity grew more difficult as external pressure increased. Stress reveals hidden divisions. Disagreements once manageable can become serious when stakes rise. Leaders must navigate not only law enforcement threats, but also internal emotions, fear, ambition, resentment that intensify during uncertain times. Stability becomes harder to preserve with each passing day. Investigators understood this dynamic well. History showed that powerful criminal networks often weakened from internal strain as much as from external prosecution. By applying steady pressure rather than sudden force, law enforcement allowed tension to build naturally within the organization. The strategy required extraordinary patience, but when successful, it could dismantle systems once considered invulnerable. Time continued moving forward, indifferent to confidence or reputation. Every year added new information to investigative files. Every conversation carried the possibility of becoming evidence. Every decision made under pressure risked unintended consequence. The gap between public image and private reality narrowed slowly but relentlessly. For Gotti, the challenge became sustaining authority while unseen forces gathered strength. Leadership meant appearing certain even when uncertainty existed. It meant inspiring loyalty while recognizing that loyalty could change. It meant standing in the spotlight while knowing that the brightest light can also reveal the smallest flaw. The illusion of permanence surrounding power began to feel less secure, not visibly, not dramatically, but quietly, like the first faint sound of something shifting deep below the surface. Such moments rarely attract immediate attention. They pass unnoticed by crowds focused on louder events. Yet, in retrospect, they often mark the beginning of transformation. Law enforcement preparations were approaching a level where patience would soon give way to action. Evidence accumulated across years was nearing the point of legal strength. Strategies refined through experience were ready to be tested. The long silence before confrontation was drawing to a close. Still, from the outside, confidence remained the dominant image. Supporters continued believing in untouchable authority. Public fascination persisted. Headlines reflected drama more than reality. Few could see how much had already changed beneath the surface. History often turns not at the peak of visible power, but at the moment when hidden pressure finally reaches breaking point. What appears strongest just before collapse can, in truth, be closest to falling. The challenge lies in recognizing that moment before it arrives. John Gotti stood within that fragile space between appearance and truth, still powerful, still confident, yet increasingly surrounded by forces determined to test both. The cracks forming beneath the surface remained invisible to most, but they were real, and they were widening. And once such fractures grow deep enough, the question is no longer whether change will come, only when. There are moments in history when movement becomes unavoidable, when years of patience and preparation suddenly begin to converge toward action. These moments rarely arrive with noise at first. Instead, they unfold quietly, almost invisibly, as separate efforts align into a single direction. For those being watched, the change may not be obvious until the distance between freedom and consequence has already begun to close. Across the closing years of the 1980s, law enforcement agencies in the United States had refined their understanding of organized crime to an unprecedented degree. Investigators no longer focused only on individual acts. They studied entire systems: how authority flowed, how money traveled, how loyalty was enforced, and how silence was protected. This broader view allowed them to build cases designed not merely to disrupt, but to dismantle. The strategy demanded extraordinary discipline. Surveillance teams observed patiently, often for months at a time, documenting patterns that seemed insignificant in isolation but meaningful when combined. Conversations were analyzed for implication rather than confession. Financial movements were traced through layers of businesses and intermediaries. Each small discovery added another thread to a web slowly forming around powerful figures who still appeared secure in public view. John Gotti continued living within that public confidence. His presence remained bold, his posture unshaken, his reputation reinforced by years of avoided conviction. Supporters saw strength that seemed almost permanent. Even critics struggled to predict how legal systems could succeed where earlier attempts had failed. The appearance of control remained convincing, perhaps even to the man at the center of it. Yet investigations had reached a different level than before. Legal tools developed specifically to confront organized criminal enterprises allowed prosecutors to present patterns of behavior rather than isolated incidents. Cooperation between federal and local authorities strengthened the reach of each case. Informants, once rare, became central to understanding internal operations. Evidence that might once have seemed incomplete now formed part of a much larger picture. Inside the criminal organization, tension had grown subtle but persistent. Increased caution shaped daily routines. Meetings became more selective. Words were chosen carefully, sometimes replaced with silence. Trust still existed, yet the certainty surrounding that trust had begun to weaken. In environments where loyalty is everything, even a small doubt can carry enormous weight. Leadership under these conditions becomes a test of endurance. Authority must remain visible enough to inspire confidence, yet controlled enough to avoid unnecessary exposure. Every decision must balance strength against caution. Every public moment must conceal private awareness that the situation may be shifting in ways not fully understood. For Gotti, maintaining calm certainty remained essential. Reputation depended on it. Loyalty depended on it. The entire structure surrounding him depended on the belief that control remained absolute. Any visible hesitation could create ripple effects impossible to contain. Confidence, whether fully genuine or carefully maintained, became a form of protection. But confidence cannot stop time. Investigators had reached a stage where observation alone was no longer the goal. Preparation was giving way to execution. Evidence gathered across years had matured into legal strategy. The slow tightening of the net, once only metaphorical, was becoming real. Public awareness, however, still lagged behind reality. Media stories continued focusing on spectacle, personality, and courtroom drama, rather than the quiet accumulation of proof. Many observers believed the pattern would repeat endlessly: accusation followed by escape, scrutiny followed by survival. Few recognized how different the situation had become beneath the surface. Communities affected by organized crime carried their own quiet expectations. Some hoped long-standing fear and instability might finally diminish. Others worried that confrontation could bring violence or uncertainty. Most simply waited, uncertain whether change would truly arrive. History had taught them patience, but also caution against believing too quickly in promises of justice. Family life near the center of power grew heavier with unspoken concern. Even without direct knowledge of investigations, prolonged pressure can be felt emotionally. Small changes in routine, subtle shifts in mood, and the constant presence of public attention create tension difficult to ignore. Loved ones often sense approaching change before it becomes visible to the world. Meanwhile, prosecutors and investigators prepared carefully for the moment when action would begin. Legal precision mattered more than speed. A single mistake could weaken years of work. Every detail required confirmation. Every witness required protection. The responsibility extended beyond winning a case. It involved proving that the rule of law could reach even the most powerful hidden figures. History shows that systems built on secrecy often appear strongest just before confrontation. Years of survival create belief in permanence. Success without consequence reinforces confidence. Yet when change finally arrives, it can unfold with startling speed, transforming certainty into uncertainty almost overnight. For John Gotti, the distance between public image and legal reality had grown dangerously thin. Outward strength remained visible. Inward pressure continued building. The moment when these two forces would collide was no longer theoretical. It was approaching steadily, carried forward by time itself. No reputation, no influence, no past victory could prevent what comes when preparation meets opportunity. The net, once wide and distant, was now drawing closer with quiet precision. Each movement narrowed the remaining space. Each passing day reduced the margin for escape. Still, from the outside, life appeared unchanged. Confidence filled the spotlight. Supporters believed in continued triumph. The illusion of control remained intact, fragile, but convincing. Until the moment arrived when illusion would no longer be enough. Because when the net finally tightens completely, power must face the one force it cannot command, intimidate, or outrun: judgment. Power can feel invincible when it has been tested repeatedly and survived, when every obstacle seems smaller than the ambition driving it forward. But invincibility is often an illusion, a fragile mirage created by years of careful avoidance and calculated risk. The higher the rise, the farther the fall can reach, and for John Gotti, the height of perceived untouchability would soon collide with forces that had been quietly gathering strength for years. By the early 1990s, the world around him had changed. Law enforcement's patient efforts had matured into full-scale operations capable of challenging leadership at the very top of organized crime networks. Strategies developed over decades were now ready for execution, combining surveillance, informants, financial records, and legal precision in ways that the public could barely imagine. For someone who had built a reputation on evading consequence, the environment was closing in faster than any visible sign suggested. The illusion of invincibility had allowed Gotti to maintain his confidence even under extraordinary scrutiny. Media coverage amplified his persona as a bold, fearless leader who escaped prosecution again and again. Supporters celebrated his courtroom victories, elevating him to almost mythic status. But public perception is often deceptive. Admiration and fear do not prevent evidence from accumulating or patterns from being analyzed. Inside his organization, the effects of prolonged visibility and external pressure were becoming more apparent. Loyalty remained essential, yet absolute certainty was increasingly rare. Subordinates and associates understood that the stakes had grown higher. Each misstep carried consequences far beyond what had been manageable before. In these conditions, trust must be measured constantly, and even long-standing alliances could fracture under stress. The structure he had relied on for decades began to show strain. Communications became more cautious, meetings more secretive, and decisions increasingly calculated for both impact and discretion. The dynamics of leadership changed. Authority alone was no longer sufficient to maintain control. Every choice care amplified consequence, and every moment of hesitation could become a critical vulnerability. At the same time, law enforcement's precision increased. Investigators had constructed a framework capable of connecting individual acts to the broader operations of organized crime, allowing legal action to reach leadership rather than only lower-level participants. Informants provided detailed insight into internal operations, and financial trails traced influence and movement of illicit resources with unprecedented clarity. The pieces had all been in place for years. Now, the timing of assembly and action mattered most. Public attention continued to fluctuate, creating a deceptive sense of safety. Headlines celebrated victories in court, reinforcing the perception of untouchable authority. Yet behind the scenes, cases were being prepared meticulously, each element cross-verified, each witness supported to withstand challenge. Patience had transformed into an unstoppable force, operating silently until its impact could no longer be avoided. Family and personal relationships added another layer of complexity. Loved ones experienced the pressure indirectly. Every public appearance, every legal hearing, and every subtle change in routine amplified tension. While confidence and charisma could inspire loyalty and admiration in associates, they could not protect the people closest to him from the consequences of choices that had grown riskier over time. History demonstrates that power resting on repeated avoidance of consequence is rarely sustainable indefinitely. Confidence, when reinforced by repeated survival, often leads to underestimation of risk. Reputation, when magnified by public fascination, can obscure vulnerabilities. Even the most careful strategist can face the limitations imposed by forces beyond immediate control. For Gotti, the transition from untouchable figure to exposed target began subtly, without dramatic fanfare. The patterns of observation, the accumulation of evidence, and the precision of strategy converged silently, setting the stage for a confrontation that no public display of confidence could prevent. Every interaction, every decision, and every visible gesture contributed to a record that investigators could now interpret comprehensively. Internal dynamics mirrored this growing pressure. Subordinates who had once deferred unquestioningly began to consider risk in ways that had been unnecessary before. Strategic disagreements surfaced with increasing frequency. Even loyalty, the most powerful bond in secretive organizations, was tested under circumstances no single personality could entirely control. Leadership, once an exercise in confidence and authority, now required constant adaptation to rapidly changing conditions. Law enforcement moved with patience matched to the stakes. Years of careful observation, intelligence gathering, and legal preparation culminated in coordinated action. The net, meticulously woven over time, was now ready to close. Visibility that had once enhanced reputation now magnified vulnerability. Fame, which had shielded him from ordinary consequences, could not protect against the weight of a system prepared for deliberate enforcement. The contrast between public perception and private reality grew stark. Supporters continued to interpret past escapes as evidence of extraordinary power. Observers outside the inner working saw only confidence and charisma. Yet the forces of consequence were approaching a point where neither confidence nor charisma could shield anyone from the impact of a meticulously executed plan. In these final moments, the difference between survival and exposure relied not on luck, not on public opinion, but on preparation, consistency, and structural vulnerability. Leadership had brought authority, but it had also brought visibility. Reputation had inspired loyalty, but it had also drawn scrutiny. Strength had cultivated fear, but it could not prevent meticulous, patient enforcement from accomplishing its purpose. History repeatedly shows that leaders who rise through boldness and ambition, who evade consequence repeatedly, eventually face forces whose patience exceeds their confidence. The combination of precision, evidence, and timing transforms inevitability from theoretical to concrete. The illusion of untouchability dissolves not in spectacle, but in quiet, unstoppable pressure, accumulating over time. John Gotti, once celebrated as the Teflon Don, now confronted the reality that power, no matter how carefully cultivated, no matter how publicly admired, cannot indefinitely withstand concentrated, disciplined action. The environment that had once allowed freedom had changed. Forces previously distant had moved decisively. The moment of reckoning had arrived. Control, influence, and reputation remained, but they were now measured against a force that neither charisma nor past victories could resist. The strength built over decades faced the first serious test it could not survive simply by belief in itself. Power in the end is never permanent. It is always subject to consequence. The most powerful illusions are those built on repeated success. When a person survives challenge after challenge, The world begins to feel predictable, controllable, even safe. But inevitability is a fragile thing. And for John Gotti, the long stretch of survival that had shaped his reputation was about to meet the immovable reality of consequence. By the early 1990s, the environment surrounding him had transformed completely. Law enforcement agencies had moved from observation to deliberate action. Years of patience, surveillance, and carefully gathered intelligence culminated in a strategy capable of reaching the highest levels of power. No longer were investigations reactive, they were premeditated, coordinated, and precise. Every step Gotti had once relied upon loyalty, secrecy, confidence was now being tested against forces that had been meticulously preparing to close the circle for years. In the criminal underworld, a leader's aura of invincibility has always been a weapon. It inspires loyalty, discourages challenge, and often creates a sense of inevitability among subordinates. Gotti had used this aura masterfully, walking confidently into situations where others might have hesitated. But when pressure builds quietly for decades, the very qualities that create authority, boldness, visibility, and decisiveness can become vulnerabilities. The environment around him became a mirror of tension. Associates who had once followed orders unquestioningly began to whisper doubts, question strategy, and measure risk in ways that had previously been unnecessary. Even small shifts in tone, gesture, or routine could ripple through the organization, signaling fear or hesitation to observers who were trained to notice it. In hierarchical systems, perception can shape reality, and cracks begin to widen in places that appear strongest. Public attention, once a tool of notoriety, now worked against him. Media coverage magnified visibility, recording every court appearance, every interaction, every movement with meticulous detail. In the past, visibility had reinforced the image of power, suggesting invulnerability. Now it became evidence for investigators, a record that helped establish patterns of behavior, movement, and decision-making. Fame had become both shield and trap. Inside the organization, the pace of decision-making intensified. Leadership that once had the luxury of measured calculation now faced moments requiring immediate response to potential threats. Communications had to be tightly controlled. Every word, every order, every meeting was scrutinized for risk. The balance between projecting confidence and managing vulnerability became increasingly delicate. One misstep could have cascading consequences across every level of the operation. Meanwhile, law enforcement worked with painstaking precision. Informants provided detailed insight into internal operations, including conversations and movements that had once seemed private. Financial records traced flows of money across businesses, and accounts designed to appear legitimate. Surveillance, combined with long-term investigative strategy, allowed authorities to connect acts previously viewed in isolation into a comprehensive picture of organizational operation. The psychological weight of leadership under these conditions cannot be overstated. Gotti's charisma and confidence had always been integral to maintaining control, but confidence alone cannot eliminate the pressure of knowing that a well-prepared system is moving deliberately toward confrontation. Emotional endurance became as critical as tactical decision-making, because even the smallest lapse could lead to irreparable consequences. Family life, too, carried its own burdens. Loved ones felt pressure not only from external visibility, but also from the quiet changes in routine, the heightened secrecy, and the awareness that danger was never far away. Protecting family while maintaining authority in a world where every movement could be monitored created tensions impossible to fully escape. Personal strength and professional strategy intersected constantly, leaving little room for error. The networks of power that had once seemed unshakable began to reveal vulnerabilities. Long-term alliances, once guaranteed by mutual interest, now faced the stress of impending pressure. Individuals who had previously deferred to authority began to calculate risk in new ways. Even the strongest structures can erode under prolonged observation and patient strategy. The environment that had enabled freedom now presented constraints that could not be ignored. As the net closed, the illusion of invincibility began to crack. Legal authorities were no longer relying on hope or perception. They were executing a coordinated strategy designed to remove authority, limit influence, and secure accountability. What had once been avoided through visibility, confidence, and public persona was now being confronted with the precise tools of evidence analysis and strategic timing. History has shown that downfall rarely happens through sudden dramatic events alone. Instead, it arrives through sustained pressure, patient accumulation of evidence, and careful exploitation of weaknesses that have existed all along but remained hidden beneath the surface. For someone whose reputation was built on defying consequence, The psychological impact of this pressure can be as significant as the legal reality itself. Gotti faced a dual challenge, sustaining his own authority while managing an organization that depended on it, all while knowing that forces beyond his control were closing in. Confidence, charisma, and boldness could no longer guarantee survival. Every decision required careful calculation, every action carried weight, and every misstep risked exposure. The balance between strength and vulnerability had shifted irreversibly. No longer was leadership simply a matter of maintaining respect or loyalty. It now demanded navigating a landscape where every choice could alter the outcome in ways impossible to reverse. The pressure built quietly, cumulatively, and inevitably toward a confrontation that had long been prepared, hidden beneath years of observation and patience. At this point, the line between power and consequence had thinned. Public perception of invincibility clashed with private realities of exposure. Supporters remained confident, investigators remained patient, and the organization itself operated under a tense duality, appearing strong while internally adjusting to the increasing threat. The truth of leadership in such an environment is simple: authority, no matter how carefully constructed, is never permanent. Power can be maintained only as long as the system that supports it remains unbroken. When external pressure, patient strategy, and internal tension converge, even the most confident figure must confront vulnerability. John Gotti's era of unchecked public confidence was ending. The careful equilibrium that had sustained his leadership under scrutiny for years had shifted, and forces beyond charisma and reputation were now asserting control. The stage was set for the moment when visibility, fame, loyalty, and law would collide, bringing the untouchable into the arena of inevitable reckoning. What comes next is a test of every lesson learned, every strategy executed, and every relationship carefully maintained over a lifetime. The world watches, the system acts, and the leader must face what no reputation, no confidence, and no skill can fully prevent: the consequences of choices made in a life lived on the edge of law and power. Power is a delicate balance, maintained not only by strength and influence, but also by perception and timing. When authority becomes visible, the forces working against it often gather quietly, methodically, and relentlessly. In the case of John Gotti, years of bold leadership, confidence, and public attention had built an image of invincibility, yet beneath the surface, forces prepared for confrontation had already begun to shift the equilibrium. The moment of reckoning was approaching, and the illusion of control faced its most significant test. By the early 1990s, law enforcement had perfected the patient strategy of observation, infiltration, and evidence collection. Surveillance teams monitored movements with unprecedented precision, listening to conversations, tracking associates, and mapping influence. Financial records revealed connections that had previously appeared opaque, exposing transactions that tied operations together in ways impossible to ignore. Investigators understood that dismantling such an organization required more than arresting a single figure. It demanded careful construction of a case capable of reaching the top, while minimizing risk of failure. Within the organization, internal tension began to rise as pressure from outside grew. Loyalty, the foundation of authority, became conditional, tested by stress, scrutiny, and uncertainty. Associates who had once deferred unquestioningly now acted with caution, sometimes hesitation, and occasionally fear. Subtle signals, from tone of voice to timing of responses, carried significance. Even the strongest leaders can sense cracks in their foundation long before the first visible fracture appears. Gotti continued to project confidence, maintaining the public image that had defined him for over a decade. Court appearances, media scrutiny, and internal oversight were all arenas in which he excelled, but the underlying pressure was relentless. The gap between appearance and reality narrowed steadily, and the world outside remained largely unaware of the quiet, unstoppable work that was reshaping the environment around him. Confrontation rarely arrives with fanfare. It begins with small moments that accumulate significance over time. A single intercepted conversation, a minor error in operational planning, or an associate turning into an informant can change the entire trajectory of authority. By the time these signals are combined, the structure that once seemed invincible may be vulnerable in ways no single participant anticipated. The legal system, armed with patience and evidence, was ready to act. Prosecutors had built cases not on conjecture, but on verified patterns of behavior, linking actions to leadership in ways that left little room for defense. Informants provided first-hand accounts of operations, revealing both the scope of authority and the methods used to enforce it. Financial trails connected operations across businesses, demonstrating influence and decision-making at the highest levels. The convergence of these elements created a force that no public reputation or courtroom charisma could entirely counter. As these pressures mounted, the environment within the organization became increasingly tense. Decisions that had once been routine now carried enormous weight. Meetings required heightened secrecy, and even simple conversations became acts of strategic calculation. Leadership demanded not only confidence but continuous vigilance, as every action could be scrutinized, recorded, and analyzed by forces positioned to capitalize on the slightest weakness. Fame, which had long served as both a shield and a tool, now amplified vulnerability. Every public appearance was documented, every statement replayed, and every gesture analyzed. Visibility, which had previously enhanced authority and inspired loyalty, now provided investigators with patterns they could study, weaknesses they could exploit, and insights into behavior that might have remained hidden under lower profiles. The very image that once protected Gotti now contributed to the tightening of the net. Family life became even more complex under these conditions. The people closest to him experienced the indirect weight of legal pressure, media attention, and potential danger. Private moments carried the awareness that consequences could extend beyond the individual adversary, touching loved ones who had previously relied on the stability provided by authority and control. Emotional resilience became as critical as strategic foresight. Public fascination continued, yet it was no longer solely an advantage. Headlines and television coverage amplified drama without reflecting the invisible legal strategy developing simultaneously. Supporters celebrated reputation, law enforcement moved quietly, deliberately, and methodically. The convergence of patience, evidence, and strategy transformed what had once been the untouchable into a target both public and private forces could reach. The moment of confrontation arrived without warning to the public eye, but with precision for those prepared. Arrests were executed, legal filings were submitted, and the machinery of justice moved swiftly through the system. Authority, once amplified by confidence and charisma, now confronted a force built to withstand evasion, deception, and influence. What had appeared untouchable was now exposed to consequence. Within the organization, the effect was immediate. Shock, fear, and uncertainty rippled through ranks previously disciplined by loyalty and hierarchy. Leadership that had relied on control and reputation found itself tested by a sudden absence of certainty. Subordinates who had once deferred unquestioningly were now faced with decisions under entirely new conditions. Authority, previously assumed, became a responsibility under extreme pressure. The collapse of the untouchable reveals fundamental truths about power. No reputation, no public image, no charisma can indefinitely shield anyone from forces designed to enforce accountability. Strength built over years can be reduced in moments when patient preparation, strategic action, and internal vulnerabilities converge. Confidence, while essential for leadership, cannot replace structural resilience when the environment itself shifts toward enforcement. For Gotti, this period marked the definitive test of survival against consequence. The carefully cultivated image of invincibility faced its first true challenge. Visibility, fame, and loyalty, which had once reinforced authority, now contrasted sharply with the legal and operational reality. Every decision, every conversation, every relationship was tested in ways that could no longer be avoided. The lesson of this moment is as simple as it is profound. The higher one rises through power built on perception and influence, the more fragile that perception becomes when confronted with methodical, patient, and unavoidable reality. Illusions of invincibility crumble not under spectacle or noise, but under the quiet accumulation of prepared consequence. John Gotti's confrontation and subsequent collapse serve as a reminder that leadership is never absolute, that visibility can be both strength and liability, and that the forces of consequence, once aligned and patient, are impossible to evade forever. Even the most confident, charismatic, and powerful individuals must face the reality that no image, no reputation, and no influence can indefinitely outpace prepared accountability. Once the force of consequence begins to move, every day becomes a test of endurance, strategy, and awareness. The confidence that carried a leader through years of influence no longer guarantees security. Every decision is measured against the potential for exposure. Every conversation is examined for hidden meaning. Every alliance is evaluated not only for loyalty, but also for the stability it can provide under intense scrutiny. For John Gotti, life shifted dramatically once legal pressures, media attention, and investigative efforts converged. The public perception of invincibility collided with private realities of accountability. Fame, which had once magnified authority, now amplified vulnerability. Courtrooms, surveillance reports, and financial investigations became arenas where every prior action, every decision, and every movement was interpreted for significance. The untouchable figure was now living in the shadow of consequence. The psychological toll of this environment is often underestimated. A leader accustomed to absolute control must now navigate constant uncertainty. What was once predictable, the reactions of associates, the loyalty of subordinates, the rhythm of operations, was now subject to new pressures. Patience and emotional endurance become as essential as strategic skill. Fear, stress, and the burden of responsibility weigh heavily, sometimes in silence, sometimes in subtle behavioral shifts, visible only to those paying close attention. Within the organization, dynamics shifted in response to new realities. Subordinates who once deferred unquestioningly now calculated risk, evaluated loyalty, and considered alternative alliances. Leadership that had previously relied on unquestioned authority now required negotiation, reassurance, and constant management of perception. Trust, the foundation of criminal operations, became conditional, tested by the ongoing presence of external scrutiny and internal stress. Family life, always intertwined with professional responsibility, became increasingly complex. Loved ones, while physically removed from the legal proceedings, felt the pressure indirectly through changes in routine, heightened secrecy, and the uncertainty of what the future might hold. Emotional resilience became necessary not only for the leader but for the entire household, where the consequences of public exposure and legal accountability were inescapable realities. Public perception continued to oscillate. Media coverage highlighted courtroom drama, legal maneuvers, and personal statements, creating a narrative that sometimes distorted the realities of legal strategy. Supporters clung to familiar images of confidence and boldness, while critics observed the cracks forming in real time. Yet beneath the surface, investigators continued their work with patience and precision, understanding that dismantling influence requires methodical execution rather than spectacle. One of the most challenging aspects of life under scrutiny is the awareness that every past decision is now open to interpretation. Movements once considered strategic can be reframed as reckless. Alliances previously assumed secure are reevaluated under the lens of vulnerability. Reputation, once a shield, can become a liability, magnifying exposure instead of protecting against it. Leaders must adapt continuously, balancing confidence with caution, boldness with restraint. The concept of consequence extends beyond immediate legal threat. It includes the erosion of control over perception, the weakening of internal authority, and the challenge of maintaining cohesion among associates whose loyalty is tested by fear and uncertainty. The world outside observes drama, but the inner reality involves complex management of people, information, and emotions, all while under relentless pressure from forces that do not tire or waver. At this stage, every decision has amplified significance. Routine actions, attending meetings, managing, communication, allocating resources, carry potential for misinterpretation or exploitation. The constant tension between maintaining authority and avoiding exposure defines the rhythm of daily life. Strategic thinking must account not only for short-term outcomes, but for the long-term implications of visibility, loyalty, and potential legal consequences. Gotti's experience highlights an enduring truth about leadership in high-risk environments. Authority built on perception and influence can be sustained only as long as underlying structural and operational integrity remains intact. Once external forces, patient and prepared, begin to exert pressure, the dynamics of control shift dramatically. Confidence alone cannot counteract systematic scrutiny and deliberate enforcement. In this shadow of consequence, adaptability becomes critical. Leaders must recognize that what worked in the past may no longer be sufficient. Visibility must be managed carefully, decisions must be calculated with extreme precision, and relationships must be continuously evaluated for stability under new pressure. Failure to adjust can accelerate the collapse that patience and strategy have set into motion. The lesson extends beyond the criminal world. Life demonstrates repeatedly that power, influence, and authority, no matter how carefully cultivated, are vulnerable when patience, evidence, and persistent pressure converge. Success achieved through boldness, charisma, or confidence cannot indefinitely withstand a system designed to enforce accountability. Adaptation, foresight, and humility become essential to navigating any environment where the stakes are high and the consequences are inevitable. For John Gotti, living in this shadow meant acknowledging that visibility, reputation, and charisma, while once sufficient to maintain authority, were no longer guarantees of security. The forces he had once evaded had become methodical, patient, and unstoppable. Each day required careful calculation, each action carried risk, and every relationship demanded constant attention. Authority now existed under pressure rather than freedom, a reality that defines the final stages of any career built on influence in high-stakes, high-risk environments. The shadow of consequence is unrelenting, yet it teaches lessons that certainty cannot. It highlights the importance of humility, foresight, and respect for systems larger than the individual. It demonstrates that perception, reputation, and influence, while powerful, are fragile when confronted by methodical, patient forces of accountability. Survival requires more than charisma. It requires preparation, adaptability, and awareness of forces beyond personal control. Even the most confident leader, the most charismatic figure, and the most untouchable persona must eventually navigate life under the weight of consequence. Every decision, every action, every alliance becomes a test, not only of skill but of endurance, judgment, and insight. And in this environment, the true measure of leadership is not the image projected to the world, but the ability to maintain integrity, resilience, and awareness in the face of forces that cannot be ignored. The moment of accountability arrived not with spectacle, but with stark reality. When authority is stripped of freedom, visibility loses its protective power, and influence is constrained by walls rather than respect. Survival becomes a daily calculation measured in routine, vigilance, and resilience. For John Gotti, life behind bars was a stark contrast to the commanding presence he had cultivated for decades, a place where reputation mattered, but only insofar as it could protect against new forms of pressure and danger. Prison is a world defined by structure and hierarchy. The rules are explicit, and yet power within those walls often mirrors the same invisible dynamics found outside. Influence is never entirely erased. It is reshaped by proximity, alliances, perception. Leadership depends less on charisma and more on strategic navigation of relationships, reputation, and survival. Even the most confident individual must understand that physical confinement amplifies vulnerability while testing endurance and adaptability in ways no courtroom or public stage can replicate. The environment inside was unfamiliar yet demanding. Daily life revolved around regimented schedules, monitored interactions, and the constant awareness that every action could carry consequences. Routine, once optional, now dictated survival. Meals, movement, communication all required awareness of both rules, and the unspoken hierarchy that governs life in confinement. Authority can only exist insofar as it adapted to these conditions. Social dynamics became a critical focus. Fellow inmates observed behavior for signs of strength, weakness, and opportunity. Reputation from the outside carried weight, but it was insufficient alone. Respect had to be earned within the immediate environment, often through demonstration of resilience, strategic alliances, or the quiet assertion of competence. Misjudgment could lead to conflict, isolation, or direct threat. Survival demanded constant awareness, careful assessment of risk, and measured engagement. Isolation from the world outside created a unique form of psychological pressure. Control over personal schedules, business, and influence diminished significantly. Relationships with associates, formerly guided by authority and loyalty, now depended on intermediaries and legal counsel. Communication became a precious resource, limited and carefully managed to avoid exploitation or legal jeopardy. The illusion of untouchable authority vanished, replaced by a reality in which every connection had risk and every interaction required caution. Legal proceedings continued to influence daily life. Court appearances, hearings, and negotiations demanded attention, patience, and careful strategy. The legal system became an omnipresent force, shaping the environment through rules, schedules, and procedural demands. Even absent direct engagement, the knowledge that evidence and enforcement extended into the facility created tension, reminding inmates that freedom was no longer guaranteed, and every action carried potential consequences. Adapting to confinement required the transformation of leadership style. Bold public charisma gave way to quiet observation, strategic influence, and careful management of perception. Authority could not rely on reputation alone. It demanded situational intelligence, emotional endurance, and the ability to navigate complex networks within the facility. Subtlety replaced spectacle, patience replaced visibility, and resilience replaced overt control. Family ties, once maintained through proximity and social visibility, now relied on structured communication, careful messaging, and enduring emotional connection despite barriers. Loved ones outside the walls experienced a parallel tension, balancing hope, fear, and the understanding that support could not remove exposure or mitigate consequence. Emotional resilience became critical for both the individual confined and those connected to him, shaping relationships in new, complex ways. Even routine interactions required strategic calculation. Conversations with guards, fellow inmates, or legal representatives carried implications beyond immediate context. Every word and gesture could be interpreted, manipulated, or leveraged. Influence depended on perception of competence, resilience, and adaptability. Reputation alone was no longer a shield. Behavior had to consistently align with projected authority while accounting for risk within a highly controlled environment. Prison life highlighted the limits of control and the enduring necessity of adaptability. Decisions that were once simple, how to manage and associate, how to respond to a challenge, how to assert influence, now required careful evaluation of both immediate and long-term consequences. Leadership had shifted from commanding presence to strategic navigation, from public spectacle to quiet, calculated action under pressure. The psychological dimension of confinement revealed lessons often ignored by those outside. Authority is temporary, influence is conditional, and survival depends on the ability to adjust to constraints beyond personal control. Every success outside had relied on perception, charisma, and strategic alliances. Inside, success required patience, vigilance, and continuous recalibration of risk. The dynamics of survival became subtle, internalized, and persistent, shaping behavior in ways invisible to the casual observer. Time in confinement offered perspective. External power, fame, and reputation, while valuable, were no longer sufficient to maintain authority. The structures and systems that enforce accountability are indifferent to reputation or confidence. They rely on methodical, consistent application of rules, evidence, and oversight. The untouchable figure, once defined by visibility and influence, now faced the reality that survival is ultimately determined by resilience, adaptability, and respect for the forces that cannot be circumvented. John Gotti's experience behind bars demonstrates that leadership is not merely about commanding presence or public perception. It is also about endurance, careful observation, strategic relationships, and the ability to navigate environments where control is limited and vulnerability is constant. The skills required to survive under such conditions extend beyond charisma. They require patience, insight, and humility. Even in confinement, influence persisted, but it was transformed. Decisions, communications, and interactions required precision. Every choice carried risk and potential consequence. Leadership was now measured less by boldness than by the ability to survive, adapt, and maintain stability in an environment defined by constraint and scrutiny. Authority had shifted from dominance over others to control over oneself, and the immediate environment a test far more demanding than any public stage, courtroom, or street-level operation had ever required. In this world, the illusion of invincibility gives way to enduring truth. Reputation alone cannot withstand sustained consequence, and survival depends on awareness, adaptability, and the recognition that control is limited. Power is temporary. Authority is conditional. And every individual eventually faces forces that cannot be avoided or outmaneuvered. The prison environment became both a crucible and a lesson, demonstrating that true resilience lies not in the avoidance of consequence, but in the capacity to navigate it with intelligence, strategy, and endurance. In this shadow, every action, word, and decision mattered, revealing the ultimate challenge of leadership when freedom is constrained and accountability is unavoidable. Confinement offers a perspective few experience outside the bounds of circumstance. When the world narrows to a few walls, a small circle of interactions, and limited control over daily life, the illusions that once defined power, reputation, and influence begin to fade. For John Gotti, life behind bars was more than punishment. It was a mirror reflecting both decisions made and the consequences that followed. Within this reflection, lessons emerged, insight sharpened, and a deeper understanding of vulnerability began to take root. Isolation, in many ways, reveals the true nature of authority. Outside, leadership is often measured by visibility, perception, and the responses of others. Inside, authority is measured differently by patience, adaptability, and the ability to maintain stability under conditions that leave little room for error. The tools of command that worked in the streets, in courtrooms, or in public arenas no longer applied in the same way. Confidence had to be balanced with caution. Boldness had to coexist with careful observation. The external image of invincibility mattered little. What mattered most was internal resilience and strategic judgment. Life in confinement also highlighted the interconnectedness of decisions. Every choice made years before, every risk taken, and every relationship cultivated carried consequences that now played out under scrutiny. Actions that once seemed justified by ambition or necessity now demanded examination through the lens of accountability. Reflection revealed patterns, both wise and reckless, and illuminated the true cost of choices made in pursuit of power. In this environment, time itself took on new meaning. Days, once filled with movement, influence, and negotiation, were now defined by routine and observation. The slow passage of hours created a unique kind of introspection, forcing a focus on priorities, regrets, and lessons unexamined during the chaos of public life. For those who survive in high-pressure, high-stakes worlds, this reflective time becomes a crucible for understanding not only the mechanics of authority but also its moral, emotional, and human dimensions. Relationships, both past and present, became a central point of reflection. Loyalty, once assumed through fear or respect, was now appreciated as a fragile and precious thing. Trust, once an instrument of power, was recognized as the foundation for survival in all forms. The bonds that endure under pressure reveal the nature of influence more clearly than any public display or reputation ever could. In isolation, the depth of these connections and the consequences of their neglect became impossible to ignore. The contrast between freedom and confinement also underscored the true weight of accountability. Outside, evasion of law and consequence created a sense of invulnerability. Inside, limitations made the scope of influence tangible and finite. Authority could no longer extend unchallenged across systems or networks. Every move was subject to observation, every interaction potentially significant. The world had contracted, yet the complexity of relationships, strategy, and consequence remained profound. Reflection also revealed the illusion of control. For decades, visibility, reputation, and confidence had been powerful tools, sometimes allowing survival against overwhelming odds. Yet in confinement, those tools proved insufficient against systematic, patient enforcement. True control, it became clear, was never about appearance or perception alone. It required adaptability, foresight, and the understanding that external forces operate independently of personal will. As insight deepened, so did the awareness of mortality and legacy. Authority, influence, and notoriety are fleeting. Decisions echo long after immediate consequences are faced. Life in confinement offered a rare vantage point to evaluate what endures, what fades, and what truly matters. Reflection revealed not only the cost of ambition, but also the importance of prudence, patience, and ethical consideration. The pursuit of power, when untempered, carries consequences that extend far beyond personal ambition, touching family, associates, and communities alike. The lessons of this period were both practical and philosophical. Strategically, it became evident that patience, precision, and adaptability are essential in environments where stakes are high and oversight is constant. Psychologically, it became clear that resilience and self-awareness are more valuable than reputation or charisma. Morally, the experience illuminated the consequences of decisions that prioritize ambition over ethics and power over prudence. Each reflection built a more nuanced understanding of what leadership truly requires. Even within the limited environment of confinement, influence persisted, but it was transformed. Authority no longer relied solely on dominance. It required empathy, judgment, and the ability to navigate subtle human dynamics. Survival depended not only on strength, but on understanding the motivations, fears, and priorities of others. Every interaction became a lesson in strategy, emotional intelligence, and measured action. Time in confinement also revealed the value of knowledge and preparation. Every piece of information gathered, every relationship nurtured, and every strategy developed prior to confinement became a resource. Yet, it also revealed the limits of prior power. No amount of preparation can completely eliminate vulnerability. The forces of consequence operate with patience, precision, and independence, reminding that no individual is beyond the reach of accountability. Reflection, above all, allowed the recognition of personal responsibility. While external forces enforced consequence, every step that led to confinement had been influenced by decisions made freely. Understanding that reality is both humbling and clarifying. It reinforces the truth that leadership, influence, and power carry responsibility that cannot be evaded indefinitely. Every action, every decision, and every choice leaves a mark, shaping both immediate outcomes and long-term legacy. Through this process, a deeper understanding emerged of what is enduring and what is ephemeral. Power and fame are fleeting. Reputation can protect temporarily but not eternally. Visibility can inspire admiration but also magnify vulnerability. What endures is adaptability, resilience, insight, and the capacity to learn from consequence. True authority lies not only in commanding others, but in mastering oneself, understanding the consequences of action, and navigating environments with awareness and integrity. John Gotti's time in confinement illustrates a universal principle. The ultimate measure of leadership is revealed not during moments of unchallenged success, but under sustained pressure and consequence. Those who endure do so by combining strategic skill, emotional intelligence, and personal reflection. Those who rely solely on perception, fame, or charisma eventually confront the limits of influence. In the silence of confinement, lessons crystallize. Power without prudence is fragile. Reputation without accountability is temporary. Authority without adaptability is unsustainable. Survival depends not on avoiding consequence but on understanding it, preparing for it, and navigating it with insight, discipline, and endurance. In these conditions, the individual is tested not by external admiration or fear, but by internal strength, clarity, and resilience. Life rarely offers a clear roadmap, especially when choices are made in pursuit of power, notoriety, or influence. For John Gotti, the culmination of decades spent navigating the criminal underworld, evading law enforcement, and commanding loyalty provided a perspective few experience, but at an extraordinary cost. The final chapter of his story is not about dramatic escapes, high-profile trials, or public headlines. It is about the weight of decisions, the consequences of ambition, and the enduring truths that emerge when visibility, power, and reputation are confronted by the unyielding reality of accountability. Confinement transforms perception. Freedoms once taken for granted, movement, influence, and the ability to make unilateral decisions become constrained by systems beyond individual control. Every action is observed, recorded, and interpreted. Every communication carries potential consequence. In this environment, the lessons of power, survival, and leadership become tangible in ways the streets or courtrooms never fully reveal. Authority is no longer about presence or intimidation. It is about patience, insight, and the careful balance of influence within strict limitations. Reflection exposes the duality of ambition and consequence. Decisions that once seemed necessary or advantageous reveal long-term costs. Relationships forged in the name of loyalty can later become sources of vulnerability. Alliances maintained through fear or manipulation may crumble under sustained pressure. Influence, even at its peak, is never permanent. The very qualities that create power, boldness, visibility, charisma can, over time, become liabilities when forces of accountability gather strength and precision. This period of reflection also reveals universal truths about human behavior. Leadership is inseparable from responsibility. Every decision echoes beyond the immediate moment, influencing not only the individual but also those connected to them, family, associates, and communities. Success achieved at the expense of ethical considerations often carries hidden costs that only become clear under sustained scrutiny. Survival requires not only skill but the humility to recognize limits, the foresight to anticipate consequences, and the adaptability to respond to evolving challenges. In confinement, time becomes both a teacher and a mirror. Extended periods of observation and routine illuminate patterns of behavior, strengths, weaknesses, and miscalculations. The illusions once maintained in public of invincibility, control, or untouchability dissolve under reflection. What remains are skills of resilience, adaptability, and emotional endurance. These are the qualities that define true leadership, when freedom is constrained and consequence is inevitable. Even under restriction, influence persists, but it transforms. The ability to navigate complex human dynamics, manage perception, and maintain composure becomes more critical than any overt display of dominance. Leadership is no longer measured by fear or loyalty alone, but by the capacity to operate effectively within the constraints imposed by circumstance. Patience, strategic thinking, and emotional intelligence become essential tools, and every decision carries heightened significance. Beyond personal insight, confinement also underscores the societal dimensions of consequence. Actions, whether ethical or unethical, legal or illegal, affect more than the individual. They impact families, communities, and institutions. The pursuit of power without regard for consequence can destabilize environments far beyond immediate observation. Conversely, awareness of impact, coupled with accountability, can guide decisions toward more sustainable, constructive outcomes. The story of life lived in extremes becomes a cautionary tale for anyone navigating influence, ambition, and risk. The evolution of perspective is profound. Public image, once central to authority, loses significance when the system imposes its own rules. Reputation can inspire fear or admiration, but it cannot counterbalance careful, methodical enforcement of law and consequence. Freedom, mobility, and influence, all markers of power, must be reconciled with the recognition that no individual exists entirely beyond external forces. Survival becomes not about evasion alone, but about understanding the structures around oneself and navigating them with insight. Ultimately, the lessons extend far beyond the context of organized crime. They are relevant to anyone who pursues influence, authority, or ambition in complex environments. Power is never permanent, and visibility carries both advantage and risk. Relationships, loyalty, and trust are fragile under pressure, and decisions made without consideration for long-term impact can carry consequences beyond immediate perception. Resilience, adaptability, humility, and strategic thinking are the traits that allow individuals to navigate uncertainty, risk, and accountability with integrity. John Gotti's journey illustrates the limits of charisma, confidence, and public perception. While boldness and audacity can achieve remarkable short-term results, sustainable success requires more than flair. It requires foresight, careful assessment of risk, and the ability to operate within the boundaries of consequence. True leadership is defined not only by achievement, but by the ability to endure, adapt, and learn from both mistakes and triumphs. In reflection, one truth stands above all: every action carries weight, and every choice generates consequence. The streets, courtrooms, and public stages may reward audacity temporarily, but they do not eliminate accountability. The forces of law, ethics, and consequence operate independently, patiently, and with persistence. Recognition of these forces and the humility to respect them defines not only survival but also personal growth. Even in moments of confinement and reflection, opportunity for insight persists. Lessons drawn from past decisions provide guidance for future conduct. Awareness of vulnerability, recognition of the limits of authority, and understanding of human dynamics offer a roadmap not only for survival but for ethical, sustainable influence. The ultimate measure of leadership, then, lies in the ability to balance ambition with foresight, influence with responsibility, and power with integrity. The story closes with a reflection on the universality of consequence. No one is beyond the effects of choice, and no reputation can indefinitely shield against accountability. Life, whether in the streets or behind bars, demonstrates that true strength lies not in avoiding consequence but in understanding it, navigating it wisely, and growing from the lessons it provides. The final chapter is not defined by escape or survival alone, but by reflection, adaptation, and the enduring pursuit of wisdom in the face of human limitation. For those who observe from outside, the narrative offers insight, caution, and education. Ambition must be tempered by understanding. Leadership requires more than boldness; it demands awareness, strategy, and empathy. Reputation is fleeting, consequences enduring, and the ultimate measure of any life lived under pressure is not the power amassed, but the wisdom gained, the resilience demonstrated, and the lessons passed forward for others to learn from. In the quiet moments of reflection, the Teflon Don story transforms from legend to lesson. The boldness that captivated the world becomes a cautionary guide. The triumphs and escapes that fascinated the public become opportunities for education, and the legacy that endures is not one of invincibility, but of insight. The recognition that influence carries responsibility, visibility carries risk, and every choice matters.